title is Reflections on Leadership. I had to laugh when I looked at the picture. I was 12 years old, so if you don't recognize me from it, I understand. I've got a little bit grayer. That's part of my reflections on leadership as well. I fell in love with leadership when I was in the 4th grade. Every spring I was in Mrs. Kramer's class, and Mrs. Kramer's class had played Mrs. Townsend's class in softball. And I had started playing Little League softball, so I knew about how to organize, and Mrs. Kramer put me in charge of getting our team ready to play Mrs. Townsend's team, and I went out and did that. So I put the people in the right positions. I got them in the right lineup. We were organized to play the game when the game came to do, and when we went to get up against Mrs. Townsend's team, they were there to play playground softball, and we were there to thump them, and we did. And I always remember as I walked off the field, Mrs. Townsend came up to me, and I wasn't in her class, and she said, "Hey, Mr. Wallace," she called me Mr. Wallace in 4th grade. She said, "I want to tell you, I just saw one of the best examples of leadership I've ever seen from a 4th grader." And instantly, I remember that, even today, and that was, thinking back, I was 9, so that was almost 48 years ago. I remember that my identity changed at that point to be thinking of myself as a leader. And a lot of people don't think that way. But from then on, I always thought that I could bring something to the game. It's interesting how one sentence of encouragement from a teacher who was not mine in a minute kind of changed the destiny about how I approached things when I went out and did my job every day. The power of the word was really significant. So I began to study it, mostly through athletics. I would go to a game and watch on TV, always look forward to the chance to hear Coach talk about what they were doing. We talk about having a teachable point of view, and my teachable point of views come from athletics, come from the Bible, come from business. Those are the things I kind of have immersed myself in through the years and have an understanding about. And so we always relate from our teachable point of view. If you're a farmer, you relate about crops. If you're an artist, you relate about art. We oftentimes teach from our teachable point of view. So you'll hear a lot of athletic allusions today, probably more than you would hear from other people. But I began to study it, and I was exposed to it and had leadership positions all the way through high school and college, and actually went to graduate school to be somewhat of a leadership consultant in higher education. I thought I would be a dean of students someday, until I started having babies, or my wife started having babies. She's right up here, and I couldn't afford to raise them on an education background, so I moved into professional human resources at that point. But when I was in graduate school, I came across a book called Leadership by a guy named James McGregor Burns. And I don't recommend it to you. It's very thick and it's very boring. And the essence of what I got out of it about the first 10 pages I read, when he talked about a concept called transformational leadership versus transactional leadership. And what he said is most people think about leadership in terms of transactions, meaning that we work or we follow as a result of what we can get from the leader. If I'm your boss, you follow me because I pay you a check. Or if I'm bigger than you are, you follow me because I might be able to beat you up. But it's a leverage thing. It's about transaction. You get followership because of your relative power, your relative position, or whatever goes in that situation. And what he was calling us, he said, I want to call you to a different kind of leadership. I want to call you to a transformational leadership where 2 people get together, or 3 people, or a group, and the design is between the leaders and the followers, you're just trying to elevate the game to a different level in some fashion. It's about raising everybody up. It's about raising the tide, if you will. And so for a transformational leader to be different from a transactional leader, you have to be able to step back and say, okay, how am I going to impact this for the positive? How will someone who follows me be able to get something out of it that's more than just a paycheck? And how will I get something out of it that's more than just getting their effort or their labor as they go through? So what I've gone through is I've thought through about 11 different verbs. I hope I didn't overpack the hour that we're going to have, but I came up with kind of 11 verbs for transformational leadership. And the first one is model. Okay. And model is that you've got to be a role model before you are the role model, is what I like to say. Okay. You establish yourself when you go into a working environment or any team, and people take stock of who you are and how you approach things. And so what kind of effort do you give? What kind of teammate are you? Do you show up on time? Do you dig in when the digging's necessary? What kind of relationship do you have with the teammates? Those are the kind of things that people look at as you become a model. What's your level of integrity? Do you tell the truth and then you follow up with the commitments that you make? A lot of people like to say in a leadership role, hey, I'm not going to ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself. And I got a lot of my colleagues back here, and they know me very well. And at the end of the day, you can ask them and say, what does he speak? Does he live what he says? And that'll be a reflection about whether I'm a role model of. But they also know that I ask people on my team in the pallet industry to do a lot of things that I wouldn't or couldn't do. Or in fact, they don't want me to do because I would cut my arm off or something, because I'm not very competent as it relates to those kinds of things. So you kind of go through that discussion, but what a model does is bring a competency to the situation that they're in that contributes to the welfare of the group. You want to be a model, you've got to be competent. People want to see you coming through the door, and they say, this is what this person brings to the team. And so one of the things, if you're going to be an effective model, you need to be saying, what is it that I'm competent at that people are glad I'm part of this team as a result of? And are you working on that all the time? Are you becoming more expert at that as you work through the process? Moving on from model, the next big thing that you want to look at is thinking about your communication. And there are four things I like to say about communication. One is communication is continuous. I have literally led hundreds of improvement sessions in my career, and we're talking about how can we make things better, and never once have I had a meeting where people said, hey, communication could be better. No matter how good you think you are at it, you're never good enough. Because people always want more information. They always want to be in the know. And the tendency is to keep it inside as compared to pushing it outside. So the second thing I like to say about communication is it's really important to be transparent. Transparent with feelings, transparent with numbers. In my organization, I learned the value of that. Back in, we were doing a quality organization. I was a human resources guy way before I would ever thought about CEO. I really never thought about being CEO. I grew up through the HR path. Most HR people do not get to be CEOs because they're usually in the softer side of the business. And I was leading a quality initiative at a plant, and we decided that we weren't communicating enough with our employees. And the CEO and I decided we would go around and visit our 6 locations that are around the southeast at the time, and we'd go out and do what we called a rally, and we'd speak to them about the business and things that were affecting us, and try to educate them at a higher level, because previously we'd always thought, well, that was our business as a management team, but the employees didn't really care about it. And what we learned is, if you don't share the full story with everybody on your team, they make stuff up. Has that been your experience? You ever hear logic that's coming back at you saying, we know why you do that? And you say, man, that's not even close to the story. Let me tell you what the real story is. And so one time we were out talking about a plant. We were visiting a plant we just opened in a recent year. It's been about $1.5 million getting it open, and it was right after the Clinton, this is going back some, the Clinton tax increase. And my boss, I was sitting in the front, my boss is Al Holland, who lives here in Bartow, so maybe some of you know him. And he was talking up front about the fact that if that Clinton tax increase had happened a year earlier, we wouldn't have had the $1 million to invest in the plant to get it started. And so I was sitting in the back, and the guy was sitting next to me, and all of a sudden he's listening to this story. He said, I done voted for the wrong son of a bitch. And it occurred to me just that moment is, hey, if I don't endeavor to educate the members of my team, who's going to educate them? At that point, it was Dan Rather. It's the news force. It's whatever you can find on TV. You know, it's not me. And I became more and more committed to that because what I found is the more we communicated transparently with them, we told them how the business was, whether it was good or bad, whether we were being successful or not. You know, it forced us into a couple things. One, it did force us into a life of integrity. We couldn't very well tell them that we were doing extremely well without coming back to them and sharing in that wealth with them. But we also couldn't ask them for sacrifice if we weren't telling them the story about what was needed in terms of being able to make it when tough times came. Transparency was critically important. And so when I got to be in charge over the years, we build up at our company now, we have a website or an intranet, full-time intranet editor. And if you went on that site, you can see what we spent in payroll last week. You can see how many employees that we have. You can see the most recent financial statement. You can see the most weekly sales numbers. You can see our safety information. You can see diet stuff, so maybe you won't spend as much on medical insurance. You see a daily note. I write a note every day to my company. I brought some for you. I'll share them with you before I get out. That's the kind of communication. Transparency is incredibly important. It makes a big difference in my experience with how effective you are. If they feel like they know everything, or they know more than they thought they would, or they know more than their neighbor does about their business, the loyalty and the commitment to the organization builds up. Third thing about communication, in my mind, is courageous, or being courageous. Courageous communication, I say all the time. When I was an HR guy for a long time, and people would bring me the issues. And when I became the CEO, I noticed my phone didn't ring anymore. In fact, when my phone rings these days and people are looking for me, there's sometimes I want to run screaming from the room because I know, when they're looking for me, they finally have gotten to the point where they can't keep it to themselves any longer. And my experience is it just gets ugly. You know, there's a guy I follow, a banker named Jamie Dimon, who says, hey, problems don't age well. And so many times when the problem finally hits my desk, it's because somebody hasn't courageously communicated earlier. Been the one who was willing to be a whistleblower. Been the one who's really saying, hey boss, I think what we're doing is not going to work in the long run. You know, so many times the problems come landing on my desk and people are coming in and say, I knew this was going to happen. And I want to say, man, if you knew it was going to happen, why didn't we stop it before it got on my desk? So I talk about courageous communication all the time because it's awkward. You know, sometimes you have to confront behavior, or sometimes you got to fire somebody, or sometimes you have to say to somebody, hey, you're not getting the job done in the way I want to get it done. You're falling short of the expectation. And so many times we're not willing to say that because it comes with some baggage. We can't, imagine listening to it. You know, no one wants to hear that. No one likes that confrontation where someone comes to you and says, hey, you're doing it. But everybody likes to hear it before they get fired because they didn't, right? We owe it to them to try to correct behavior when we can. And I've made a career out of being a courageous communicator. That's why I believe in it so much. I am always the one, well, hey, that person needs to be talked to. And I'll go in and I'll practice. And have I stumbled at times? You bet. Was I good at it instantly? No, I wasn't. But what I found is if I was willing to courageously communicate, that more often than not, when the confrontation was over, the sense of relief was high. The opportunity to move forward was great. And I said, man, this works. So, and if I'm willing to do it, not everybody else, that's going to end up being good for my career, good for my influence. And so I've been wading in for a long time and willing to do that as I go. Fourth thing I'll tell you about communication real quickly, and I'll move on, is about listening as compared to talking. Is any communication strategy that you have has to be about listening to the people, listening to the team. You need to be in the pose of saying, hey, the tendency is the more formal your leadership role is, the more you feel like you've got to be the person who's doing the talking. And in my situation, I have learned that if I can sit back and listen, I get a lot more from it. And so if I have been continuously trying to improve communication, if I have been continuously trying to be transparent, and if I've been continuously being courageous, the trust level raises in the organization, and then I find that the group has a lot to say. And it builds on itself. And the listening organization is the best organization, because in any given time, and again, I'll tell you, there's not many situations in our manufacturing situation where I'm the smartest guy about the manufacturing solution. There's not many situations in the sales situation where I'm the smartest guy about being able to fix the sales situation. There's not many situations where I'm the smartest guy in the room on anything. And so the saying is, all of us are smarter than some of us. And so if we can get all those ideas raised up to the level where everybody can consider them, and they feel comfortable doing so, then we've done an excellent job on the communication front. And the communication needs the attendance of the leader all the time. Never believe you're done. It's never good enough. But the ways to make it better are transparency, courage, and listening. Third thing is learning. So I wrote a note to my group yesterday. It came out this morning because I didn't get it transferred enough. It talked about, this is an amazing statistic. There was this group called the Jenkins Group that said that 33% of high school graduates in the country never read another book. Worse, 42% of college graduates never read another book. Last year, 80% of America's families did not buy a book for its whole household. In a time where it's as easy to buy a book with Amazon and Kindles and that kind of stuff as it's ever been, we're not reading anymore. And I've always heard leaders are readers. Okay? Now, I'll grant you it's a different world today than when you went to the Barnes and Nobles. Bookstores are closing up all the time. But to me, the Kindle's the greatest thing that ever happened. When I can read about a book or see about a book, and in 90 seconds I can be reading it if I want to, that's amazing to me. And I read a lot. Those of my colleagues will tell you, sometimes they pay me just to sit back and be reading something as compared to building a palette or doing something of relative value. But the question I want you to do, the next verb is learn. And what are you doing to learn? What's your strategy for learning? Does it all come from somebody else? Do you have your own method for getting out and figuring out what you're going to learn next? Are you constantly in a study on something? And my experience is watching a lot of people of this younger generation is they're not doing a lot of learning. They don't, the media deal is a lot about texting, a lot about internet, a lot about Facebook. Listen, I'm on Facebook. I love Facebook. It's the way I keep up with all of you. It's the way I decide, hey, I'll volunteer to do this. There are a lot of people, this is a thing we want to follow. But if Facebook is your only strategy for learning, you got a big problem. And so leaders are readers, but leaders are learners. And I think that the biggest thing that you need to figure out is what's your strategy for learning if you really want to be because the learner, the reading part of it, or the getting exposed to other idea part is where all creativity comes from. take those ideas that you get from being exposed to other things and say, okay, how does that apply to my business? How does that apply to my Little League team? How does that apply to my Girl Scout troop? How does that apply to my church group? How do I get that to go? And if you're not constantly doing it, someone else is driving your leading agenda. And I want you to think about it. When I was in college in 1977, there was one computer on the campus at the University of Florida. There's more computer power in my car than there was at the University of Florida in 1977. Think about that. And certainly we've been forced to learn about that stuff, but how many of you know all the tools in your computer at the full extent that you could use them? You learn as much as necessary and as little as possible, and then you move on to something else. How many of you are fully engaged in becoming more competent at your particular craft and trade? How many of you are working outside your boundaries? So one of the key pieces of advice I'll give you on reflection is if you're not got a strategy for learning, you need to get one. And I'm probably preaching to the choir. You wouldn't have come here today if you weren't interested in learning something. But it's still an important aspect to think about in terms of how we proceed. Now, those first three verbs are all in your control, right? What kind of model you are, what kind of learner you are, what kind of communicator you are. You have absolute control of that. And I want you, as I move on to these others, this is going to be more about group skills. But these first three are individual leadership verbs. Because it doesn't matter what your boss thinks, you can communicate as transparently and as courageously and openly and listen as much as you want to. It doesn't matter what your boss thinks. You can open any book you want and pursue learning in any way that you can. It doesn't matter what your boss thinks. You can be whatever kind of model you want to be. And so those three are pretty critical to build out from to get started as you go. Fourth verb is encourage. Just think about it. I mentioned already what a word of encouragement has meant in my life when I was in the 4th grade. But the thing I want you to reflect on right now is to sit back and think about, hey, how encouraging am I as an individual? When were my last words of encouragement, and to who were they to? How about your children? How about your spouse? How about your neighbor? How about, what are you an encouraging guy? How many of you know Gerald Tucker? Who doesn't know Gerald Tucker? Gerald Tucker, when I moved to town, my first exposure to him was playing softball. And I was on a team that competed with Gerald's team. And I so admired that team and how he led that team as he was the pitcher, that I actually pitched up at that church because of that softball team. So that I been an elder at the First Presbyterian Church. I went to that church not because I loved Jesus or had a relationship or was searching for a church community. I went to that church because it was convenient to my house and they had a good softball team. My wife will verify that. And the thing I liked about Gerald was he was the most encouraging person. You know, he was a good sportsman, played aggressively, always wanted to lead, and we always wanted to win. When there would be an error on the team, he'd turn around and say, that's okay, we'll get them. You know, they played all 7 innings, always played hard. And I just said, man, that guy's an inspiration to me. I'd like to be on his team if I can get on it. And sure enough, I got on it, and we spent the next 3 or 4 years playing softball together until he got too old, you know, and then he retired. I retired after him because it just wasn't very much fun. Now you know, a lot of you know Gerald as a teacher at the middle school, same kind of encourager, right? Kids love him. He's tough, but he's fair. And then most people know him these days is what he's doing to try to eradicate cancer. What he does with his golf tournament. What he does with that. But you're glad to see Gerald Tucker coming, aren't you? You don't ever see Gerald Tucker walking down the hall or coming into your room. If you know him, you don't ever stop and say, hey, boy, he doesn't add to the room. He lights it up. Okay, and so everybody, you can be Tuck, who I regard to be 10 on the scale of encouragement, because he's lived through some hard things if you know his life. Lost 2 wives to cancer. been in a rough spot, but he has always continued to be an unsinkable spirit in terms of his positive reflection. What would people say on your encouragement quotient? Are you a 10? Being good? Or, hey, that person never has anything good to say. Never speaks to us, never talks to us, never makes a difference. But I'm telling you, the very best leaders that I've ever known have had a way to encourage people to do better, okay, through their inspiration. I'm trying to remember my notes. The next one that I want to share with you is stretch. The next verb is stretch. A firm belief that I have is that you're either getting better or you're getting worse. There's no such thing as maintaining. And so it's up to a leader to be able to bring to the situation, hey, what's next for us? What are we going to do to get better? You know, it almost sounds compulsive, because certainly there are times where you can't sit there. You want to, celebration is a big part of having a great team and organization. You want to be glad when you make an accomplishment and you reach a goal. But at the same time, if you sit there and say, okay, we've reached the goal, now we're stopped. We've done it all. I mean, if you had the experience where you thought you would reach something, and then a few weeks later, you're just stale again, right? And I think it's part of our human nature that we have to continue to stretch, because if we fall into a complacency, it's not going to work. And so it's up to the leader to kind of be able to look around and assess, well, hey, how's my team getting better? How's my business improving? How's that person that's reporting to me getting going? What can I do to help them stretch? And at the same time, you've got to be stretching yourself. It's where the learning comes back in, to taking on a new skill, defining a skill you already have. But stretch becomes an important verb for all of it. And anytime you feel like your organization isn't going as well as it should be, I think you can step back and say to yourself, hey, where's the stretch? What are we doing right now to make ourselves better? We're in our company right now, we started about a year and a half ago, a lean initiative where we're trying to teach lean, or we are teaching, not trying to. We're doing it very successfully, teaching people about an idea about lean management, which is the whole concept is that no customer wants to pay for any waste that we have to put in our experience, and so it's our job to eliminate waste. If we waste time, we waste motion, we waste product, and we try to get the customer to pay for that. You try to imagine if you took that idea, hey, we waste 5% of our wood, and we charge you for that, how do you feel about that customer? They would say, oh, I don't like that. Or we're not as efficient as we could be in terms of production of our pallets, so we charge you for that. How do you feel about that? And the customer would say, well, I don't want to pay for that. You should pay for that. And so we've learned that we can sit back and take a look at it, thinking about waste, and if we can drive the waste out of the system, we're going to get into a better place in terms of the margins we generate and the profit that we can make without charging the customer for it or not having to share it with them. But if we ever are forced to, we'll be more competitive as a result of it. And so you think about, well, stretch is constantly looking and waking up every day and say, how can I do that job that I just did yesterday at this amount of time, or got this amount of production, and see how we can improve that. How are you asking those questions? How are you demanding that of yourself? And how are you asking those questions when you go through and take a look at it? That's a big piece of what you want to do as a leader, is bring stretch to your team. Teach is another verb for a leader. And I kind of captured this. If you don't need to, and you haven't been recruited for a management spot, you probably don't want to come to work at a pallet company. Think about that. Very physically demanding. Guys that we hire, usually flunked out of high school, been to prison, have difficulties in some way, weren't as lucky as many of you were to grow up in the families that you grew up in, who got you into the right schools and got you to the right education. And so unfortunately, we get a lot of people who walk through our doors who aren't work ready. And I could blame the schools, but the fact is they probably dropped out of school and the school didn't have a good shot at it. And there were a lot of circumstances that affected them. And a few years ago, I ran across this lady named Wendy Kopp, who started an organization called Teach for America when she was coming out of college. I don't know if you ever heard of it. Her senior project was that she was concerned about the kids that were in the impoverished environments around the country, both in the ghettos of America as well as the rural areas. And it was her thought that she could recruit people who didn't train to be teachers to take a 2-year hiatus before they entered into graduate school or went on with their career, teach them how to teach, and get them out into those environments where they could make a difference where most people didn't want to go to teach. And sure enough, 20 years later, they have thousands of teachers being recruited every year. Their statistics are that 70% of them end up staying in the educational field once they get started because of the satisfaction they get from it. One of the things that she did that resonated with me was as they went and trained these teachers, they got to a point where they said, hey, it's not the student, it's the teacher. Yes, our students are coming in, they're imperfect. Yes, our students are coming in, they haven't been prepared. Yes, they don't know how to read at level. Yes, they have bad habits. And if it's going to be, it's up to us to get it done. We can't expect the family to all of a sudden turn around and the student all of a sudden turn around. We got to find a strategy that's going to work with them. And so we tried this today and it doesn't work. It's up to us to try something tomorrow, and the third day, and the fourth day. And we're not going to take no for an answer. I see a lot of people cop out on leadership and say, hey, who could do this with the people that I have to hire? And I said, so when I was listening to her talk about who she was educating, and they were getting great results, they were teaching them to read. And they were bringing them up to class. And it was because they hadn't been particularly, they didn't have a paradigm that said anything else but to do that. So we're being successful at doing it. I said, those are my employees. I need to cultivate a supervisor group that believes that just as well as those teachers do. Because when they walk in the door, they don't know to show up on time. They don't know what it is to work 8 hours hard in a row. They don't know what it is to be a good teammate because we didn't sign them up for soccer when they were 3. They don't know. And why should we expect them to know? Because we know somewhat of the environments that they're living in. So it became to me a challenge to think, okay, if that's the case, as a teacher, leadership is teaching. Not only is it reading, but it's teaching. And it's my job as a leader to find a way to reach the people I'm trying to reach. I can complain, hey, I can't reach them because they're awful, they're not talented, they aren't educated. But the truth of the matter is that what I have found is as I became transparent and a larger communicator, I got a lot of raw geniuses sitting out stacking wood. I really did. There was a time where we were doing this program and we were getting ready to invest about $300,000 in a new saw system. And I went to the plant and the guy says, who's working on the saw, he says, hey, I hear we're going to buy a new saw system. I said, yeah, we are. You'll be excited about it. And he took a nail box, a piece of cardboard, and he says, oh, I was thinking about this. And he brought me this piece of cardboard, and he had drawn out how he thought this new saw system ought to be laid out. And I was looking at this and said, Marion, I don't know about these things as well as you do. It looks pretty smart to me. And I took it to the guy who was in charge of the project, and he looked at it and he said, man, I can't believe we didn't think of that. And we ended up doing the saw system like the saw operator did. He wouldn't have been anything. He didn't have his 3 front teeth. He didn't look like anything walking through the door. But the guy was invested in what he was doing, and he was courageous enough to come up to the boss and say, hey, I drew this out on the cardboard box. This is what's going on out there. So he was teaching me. But you've got to recognize that everybody in your room has potential, and it's you who has to take on some responsibility for drawing it out. You can wish they'll get better, but the question is what are you doing to inspire them to be better? What are you doing to reach them in a different way? You know, we misconnect all the time. We see people coming through the door and say, well, that kid, you know, he doesn't come in when he has his shirt tail out and he doesn't know what's going on. And boy, I wish we had a better guy. The next person walking through the door is no better. Probably worse. And when we take on an attitude of leadership that says, hey, we're going to teach, we're going to make a difference here, it's up to us to refine our skills and improve our competency at teaching and making these people who don't know exactly how to do it right get better at it, discovering their genius because they have been in an environment where that genius has come out. We've won the lottery in America, and you won the lottery by having someone who will even pay to have you come to do this today. And it's really important for us to recognize that as we go through the process. The next one is imagine. Imagination has to come from someplace. It doesn't always have to come from you. I'm not the most creative person in my company. My job is, though, to make sure that there's not imagination going on someplace, that we're complacency. It's not only about stretching by having pure numbers. It's saying, hey, how can we get better at what we're doing? What can we do better? My little group right out here is all my human resources team and payroll team, and over the last 2 years, you know, when I think about imagination, it wasn't me who thought of them coming up with a paperless system that we've implemented that has driven out reams of paper, lots of time. All I can do is just shake my head and say, good, there's imagination occurring. I don't have to screw around with that particular department. You know, but if I can walk into a room and say, what have you done lately? How have you improved things? What are you working on? And the answer is no. I can just be the instigator of imagining things. But I also, if I'm learning and I'm working in that environment, you see how it follows? Hey, I saw this, or I read this, I learned this from a tour I took, or I went out here and did this. How does that fit with us? And you bring people into the game and you think about imagination. Leaders take on the role of being the Imagineering. That's what they call it at Disney, right? Walt Disney was the Imagineer. And they have a whole department that talks about Imagineering. But they work very hard on trying to create an environment where Imagineering will work. Another skill that a leader has to bring to it, the next verb is define. Sometimes you're just going nowhere and things aren't happening. And the leader's responsibility is to take up the pen and go to work on figuring out how to get things defined and structured so that we can have a plan to go forward. I like it. This is the greatest room in the world because it has a whiteboard all the way around it. I was sitting there thinking, man, I need to get one of these. Because my favorite technique, as I like to talk about, is to go to the board and put the problem on the wall. Make the phrase is make the problem the task. Because when you put it on the wall, and my back's to the wall, and I'm hearing what people say, I say, let's talk about the problem. And people aren't talking to each other, but they're talking to the wall. It's usually a pretty good exercise because it seems to take out the emotion. It seems to take out the personal agenda. And when you're looking at what you said and felt and it's reflected on the wall, people will begin to kind of own up to, well, I just said that, but that looks pretty stupid now it's written up on the wall. You know, it doesn't work exactly the way, it didn't come out exactly the way I wanted it to sound. And when you work the problem from the wall, you define it, and then you begin to see how the consensus develops and that kind of thing, and that's the defining role. At some point when confusion is reigning, it takes somebody to say, hey, this is what needs to happen. It's perfect if I don't have to do it. It's perfect if by be modeling the skill of defining that people begin to do that themselves in their small groups and it doesn't get to me. But my favorite technique is not to have people sitting and talking around a room, but is to get on the wall, define the problem, begin to find solutions that we could do that possibly could correct the problem, and begin to work toward a plan to get it done. Which solution are we going to And then the next thing is initiate. That's the next verb. It's once you decide, you got to go. You know, it's sometimes you get stuck into all the deciding process. We could do this, or we could do that, or we could do the other thing. And a real leader brings the task, hey, we're going to go after this now. It may not be perfect. There's a risk to it. But you got to have the confidence that, again, the courage word comes up. As a leader, you have to have the courage to know. And after you've been doing it for 40 years, you begin to understand that every time you define and take an initiative to do something, it ain't always going to work. And you can't be scared of that. You know, you kind of almost, it's against human nature. We want it to be risk-free. We want to make sure it's going to be successful. We want to make sure it goes. But I was reading an article about Peyton Manning here recently, and he was talking about the fact that if you follow NFL football, you know Peyton Manning played for the Indianapolis Colts. He has a bad neck. Had a $28 million bonus they were supposed to pay him, or they had to release him, and they decided they weren't willing to risk the $28 million on his neck as well, and all of a sudden Peyton was out looking for another job. And so he picked some teams he wanted to go visit. He's continuing his rehab, and his coach at Tennessee when he played college football was the offensive coordinator, a guy named David Cutcliffe, and David Cutcliffe is now the head coach at Duke. So when Peyton didn't have a team anymore, he went to his old coach, and they were working on his rehab. And David Cutcliffe and Peyton were sitting, he said, I really don't know how to make this choice. It's not about the money, of course. Peyton Manning's rich. I don't know how to choose a team particularly, what's going to happen, what are we going to do, how are we going to get to this decision. And Cutcliffe said to him, hey, remember the Patton principle. Now, Patton principle is General George Patton. World War II. Did anybody see the movie Patton? I didn't either. You're too young. Go home, Netflix it tonight. You'll be inspired. Okay? It really is a good movie. George C. Scott played Patton. Very exciting to watch. Abrasive. Everything you would expect a World War II general to be. But they said, what's the Patton principle? And Peyton said, yeah, just remember that. He says, make a decision and work the hell out of it. Okay? That's what initiation's about. And sometimes there gets to be that time in the room where everybody looks to the leader and says, hey, boss, what are we going to do? We discussed it. We know it. And someone has to be courageous enough to say, hey, this is where we're going. This is what we're going to do. And you can only do that if you're comfortable with the idea that it just may not work. And then what do? Go back to the board. Say, boy, that was awful. What are we going to do now? What do we learn from that? What's going to come next? How do we get going? Where do we go from here? Next verb is demand. I learned this from listening to a radio interview of Pat Summitt, who is the coach of the University of Tennessee basketball team, women's basketball team. And she is the most successful basketball coach in the history of the game. Won more games than anybody. Partly because she was good. Partly because she got started when she was like 22. And she was put in charge of the women's basketball team at Tennessee. And I don't know if you follow the game, but she has early onset Alzheimer's at this point, and is probably wrapping up her career. But this interview was going on, and they asked her, hey, what was the turning point in you becoming the coach that you have? And her answer struck me because I'm not very good at this. Is, hey, I learned that I can demand excellence from my team. I learned that I could demand excellence from my team. And what that meant was she was acknowledging until she realized that she could push them further than she felt comfortable. Where she could say to them, hey, you're not giving me the effort. You're not realizing your potential. You're not going. That's courageous communication, right? When she could run them until they would throw up into the trash cans. When she would push them beyond any level that she felt comfortable for, until she learned that she could demand excellence from her team, she never got excellent results. Now, I read about that differently about Steve. I read the biography of Steve Jobs recently, the founder of Apple. When you read his biography, you'll learn that it wasn't all hunky-dory for him. Until this most recent 10 years, he had a lot less success than he had. He had more defeats than he had successes, with balky companies not going, getting fired from his job the next time, having to go find himself again. But he was shown, they said that he had this thing they called the distortion field. And the distortion field is he would demand from people things that no one thought they could do. An example was he had his partner, Steve Wozniak, who helped him find Apple, that he told him that he could do in 4 days what Wozniak took with 30 days, but because Jobs insisted that he do it in 4 days, he got it done. And so Jobs was fond of just giving people objectives that they never thought they could do, but because he would do it over and over and over again, they would say, well, that's the distortion field, but if he's asking it, then we'll do it. I read an article consequent to that, written by the biographer, who was talking about Steve Jobs. And in this whole book, the only perspective you can have about Steve Jobs is, boy, that must have been one bad guy to work for. Okay? He didn't care about people much, or that he communicated. He would seem to be only focused on the product, only focused on the process, only working on things to do it. His compulsion was to create the best products in the world and do it, and he was very difficult to deal with. And so a lot of people took that biography and said, hey, this is not how to act. And the biographer came back and said, biographer came back and said his name was Isaacson. He came back and said, hey, don't read it that way. He said, I talked to Steve about how he was perceived by his people. And he said, look around you. They might have thought that I was prickly at times, but they stuck around because we were doing incredible stuff. And that's the next thing about demanding is there's a whole, I'm reading a book right now that makes a lot of sense to me, is that people want to be associated with leaders who are helping them progress. And they'll put up with stuff. You go all the way back to Stretch. Stretch is helping you progress. Demand is helping you progress. He said, I didn't lose those guys because we were doing incredible stuff. That's why they stuck with me. And I was willing to pay the price of being the prickly bastard who caused that to happen. I'm thinking about the last one is that's on my mind is balance. People want leaders who are resilient, who can bounce back, that don't don't lose their cool, don't lose their composure, have confidence that they know the dynamics of success and failure. Every time things get tough, they keep a perspective. I was reading an article recently by a guy named Seligman, and I'm going to give you that handout that you could read my synopsis of it. But the point is that people want resilient leaders, and a non-resilient leader takes a bad event and makes it bigger than it is. A non-resilient leader will take a bad event and say, this is the end of the world. And a resilient leader will say, no, it's a blip in the screen. We'll be able to look forward with hope and faith that there's a way through this. You know what they say about going through hell? You just keep on going and lead the way through it. So you have to balance as you go. You take a look at that as you go. Now, I was thinking about this today. When I was a senior in college, junior and senior in college, I had an experience that both talks about transactional versus transformational leadership. One of the greatest honors of my life was being elected the president of my fraternity in college. At the University of Florida, we had a large fraternity. One of the people arguably would have said it was one of the best fraternities on campus. when it came to be time for the election, I won without opposition, which was unheard of in our chapter at the time. It was a pretty cool deal, and I was very impressed with myself. So we're at the top of the world, and I think people who looked at me would have said, hey, he did it, he was accountable. I mean, I did what was expected of me. But when I think about my fraternity leadership experience, that year of the presidency that I had, it was one of the biggest leadership disappointments that I ever experienced in my life, because I just did none of those verbs I just told you about. I didn't try to take us to a new level. I tried to maintain. I didn't communicate fully because I was elected without opposition, so that meant that they had given me a mandate, and so I circled myself with my closest friends, and I made all the decisions, and I didn't communicate much, and if they didn't like it, that was okay with me. And when I wrapped up the experience, I realized, looking backwards pretty quickly, that I didn't make the most of that opportunity. I didn't follow what is now my key life verse that I follow in the Bible now: to whom much is given, much will be required. That was, to me, I was given a tremendous opportunity, and I wasn't a very faithful steward. At the same time that was going on, I coached this basketball team. And I got hired right at the beginning of my presidency, and I went through 2 seasons. And I was coaching a small private school out in Alachua, which is about 28 miles outside of Gainesville North on 441. And I got hired on a Tuesday, and I went out to meet my team. I had 13 guys, and 3 of them could play, and 10 of them had no clue. And our first game was on Friday night, and we went out, and we were playing a team called Oak Hall, which is all the rich kids in Gainesville. And the rich kids in Gainesville included the sons of, again, you guys won't know this. Anybody know the name Roger Maris? Roger Maris hit 61 home runs, and for many years had the home run record. He had moved to Gainesville to become a distributor of Busch beer. Nice guy, and his kids were good athletes. Coach Dickey, who was the head coach of Florida at the time, his son was on this team. And we went out. I took my little country kids out there. None of them knew how to play basketball. And at halftime, it was 26-4. And so I decided I would do my best Bob Knight interpretation. I yelled hard at those kids and said, "You're gutless, and you need to play harder," and that kind of thing. And we went out, and to show me how much they were inspired by me, we scored 1 basket in the second half, and we lost 54-6. And I said, boy, I'm going to have to rethink this a little bit. And so the next week, I met them at practice. I said, guys, y'all aren't very good, and I'm not a very good coach, but we're going to figure this out. And so I decided to do a couple things. One, I said, we could be in the best shape. And so I ran them hard every day. I said, we can play defense, because you don't have to have skills to play defense. You just got to be mean and aggressive. And so I taught them that we were going to full court press all the time. And I said, then we're going to work on, and you can't shoot, so we were going to work, at that time what was popular was a thing called the 4-corner offense that was created by my hero, which was the coach at North Carolina called Dean Smith. And when Dean Smith's teams were outmanned talent-wise, he had 2 or 3 good ball handlers. In the 4-corner offense, he'd set one guy in each corner and give the guy in the middle the ball. And that guy would dribble until 2 people would get on him. And the deal was, you threw the ball to the guy who came to cover you, you threw the ball to the open guy, and then he would move to the middle again. And that, in those days, Dean Smith's the reason there's a shot clock in basketball. Because he didn't mind winning a game 8-4, but it wasn't really good for the fans. Okay? So they put a shot clock in. But I taught my kids that offense. So when we get against teams that were more talented, which is often, if we got a lead, boy, we took the air out of the ball, and we'd play hard and we'd go after it. And piece by piece, by the end of the season, we were making some progress. And we ended up winning about half our games and losing about half our games. And I got that team back the next year. And all the players came back, plus another one. And this kid was a kid they called Foots. His feet were this big. And he'd never played sports at all. In fact, he was coming straight from a farm. In fact, I learned that his daddy didn't even want him to be wasting time playing sports, but he wanted to play sports. And I told you I had 3 guys who could play, and none of those were big guys. So I had these big guys that I would get, were big guys for me. They were mostly offensive tackle looking, sort of like hires. I mean, big, wide butts. Couldn't jump. I don't know if you can jump or not. But they couldn't jump. They couldn't play. And every day we'd stay at the end of practice and we'd go 20 minutes just on what I call big man camp. And it started off as simple as this. I would put them on the bottom of the deal about 3 feet from the basket. Nobody guarding them. And I said, I would throw them the ball. I said, just catch it and turn around and try to make the basket. That's how we started. It was that fundamental. Catch it, turn around, try to make the basket. And Foots, first time I ever put him in a game, he got so excited, he caught the ball, he rebounded the ball and took it and tucked it under his arm and ran up the court. But Foots was by far the best athlete of the group. And so I said, Foots is going to go pretty good here, but we're going to have to coach him up. We worked hard. So we started this season, and we played that same team again. Oak Hall, same. Came back with the same team. I came back with the same team, except I have Foots. And my team's a little bit better now, but we lose by 12 points. But we're competitive. Kids are getting fired up about playing. And we go on. We played a 14-game schedule. We won the next 12 games. Just piece by piece, getting after it. Foots would get a little bit better. My team would get a little bit better. We were playing aggressive defense. The confidence was growing. It was it was a fun time to be working with them. And we get down to the last game, and we're playing that same team. They've lost once. If we beat them, we're going to be the champions. But we've had a good year nonetheless. And so sure enough, we scrap and scrap and scrap. These were scrappy, country, gritty kids. And we play, and we get down to the last minute, 3 minutes, 3.5 minutes left in the game. I still remember it. And we're down, we're up 1 point. They throw the ball to Foots. And Foots grabs the ball right here on the block. He fakes it this way. The guy falls for the fake. He puts the ball on the ground with a dribble, catches it with this, comes back here and makes a reverse layup and puts us up 3 points. I said, man, we're ahead. So they come down, race down the court, and they get to a point where they shoot the ball and we miss and we get the rebound. And so we now have the ball with about 2.5 minutes left. And they're more talented than me, so what am I going to do? We're going to the 4 corners. And a kid about 4'8" named Bill Wheeler. And we get into the deal, and he's my dribbler, and then another kid named Jaden Lewis, another guy named Jeff Thomas. So the 3 guys I want with the ball, and they're changing, and they're going, and they're going. All we have to do is run out the clock or get fouled, make a free throw. We're going to win this game. And with about 45 seconds left, for whatever reason, Bill Wheeler, smallest guy on the floor, decides to take his man to the bucket and see if he can win the game with the layup. And I'm sitting with all my teams yelling, no! And he makes the layup. Wow. And now we're up 5. And we go down the court and we win the game. And it was one of the highlights of my life. I get goosebumps telling you that, right? Here's the point. It would have been a great story. It's a great story because we won. It would have been a good story if we lost. Because this is all about the process. And everything I didn't do with the greatest honor of my life and one of the greatest responsibilities I ever had, I was doing with these kids. I was communicating with them. I was teaching them. I was stretching them. I was demanding things better from them than they ever had. And I wouldn't trade the experience either way. You know, in business, I could have told you a bunch of business stories today. We've just been through one of the worst economies I'll ever live through as a CEO. And it's been but some of the most meaningful times that I'll ever have in my business career happened while I was wondering if we were going to be able to pay the bank. And time after time, my colleagues would come out and do heroic things. It's about the process. It's about doing it the right way. The results will take care of themselves. But leadership happens. Don't choose transaction. Don't be, hey, I'm the boss, do it my way. Choose transformation. I want to be a transformational leader. Do that with your family. Do that with your church group. Do that with your Little League team. Do that in your business. Be transformational. Happen to the world. Don't let the world happen to you. Well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.